Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Every once in a while, we're asked to do something that takes a special kind of courage. Such is the case with my guest, John West. His father had been recently diagnosed with cancer and asked him an extraordinary favor: to help him commit suicide. After the tremendous weight of those words settled squarely on West's shoulders, he looked at his father and said the only thing that he knew how to say: "You got it." John helped his father take a cocktail of pills, and by morning his father was dead. Months later, his mother asked him the same devastating favor, and again he agreed. Now, more than a decade later, West kept the secret to himself, not even telling his sisters of the role that he had played. Now he is coming out with his side of the story. John West, welcome to Radio Who, What, Why.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Why now? What is it that led you to tell this story now?
Well, I actually wanted to tell it much sooner. It's unfortunate because I would have gotten off my chest and out into the public domain sooner, but here we are now, so we get to talk about it and move people's minds forward a little bit.
What about, though, the sense that public attitude may have changed in this intervening period of time, and the story that you tell today might have been received differently 5 years ago, 7 years ago?
Oh, I think that's very true. Our nation seems to be changing in many ways. I remember John Ashcroft tried to shut down the state of Oregon's existing physician-assisted death with dignity law when he was Attorney General back once upon a time. And that kind of antithetical stance towards medical progress is certainly no longer the norm, I think, in the current administration. But this is one of those issues that seems to transcend politics, because I know a number of Republicans or people who would consider themselves conservatives believe that this is appropriate for people to have the right to do this. It's their own private body and their own private life, and it should be their own private medical choice.
What do you see from having talked about this now and written about it and lived with it for so many years? What do you see as the core issue here? Is it about religious belief? Is it about the law? What do you see as the underlying issue that divides people on this?
I think it is the kinds of things you're saying, religious beliefs. It's really more of a personal indoctrination, if you will. If you grow up in a small community where everybody wears triangular hats, then you're going to feel funny if you don't wear a triangular hat. But if you don't care for triangular hats and move somewhere else, you might feel more comfortable. That's why people move away from their small communities or even their larger communities to places that fit them emotionally and stylistically. This really boils down to a sense of, in some ways, I call it common sense, which of course is no longer all that common, which is to say that if you see, for example, an animal writhing in agony on the side of the road, a deer that's been hit by a truck or something like that, your instinct is to put it out of its misery if it's obviously dying. And we have the same feeling with pets, and many of us of a certain age have already lost our grandparents or have seen parents or siblings even, maybe work colleagues or friends or neighbors who've gone through long disabling illnesses, and we find ourselves saying, well, why? Surely there's a better way. And there is. Give those people the freedom of choice that we've given to people in other medical private matters in recent decades to do this one last favor for themselves if they wish to.
What about the people that would say that in your case, because it wasn't just the person doing it to themselves, you assisted in this, what about the people that would see this as homicide?
Well, legally it's not, and I say that as a lawyer. But if someone wanted to make the argument, then I would say, well, any time a person does make some motion and it leads to some other action, that doesn't necessarily make them culpable. It's what in the law is called mens rea, the sort of the mindset, what you're thinking at the time. It doesn't always necessarily affect the legal case, but you could make that same claim towards the doctors who do do this sort of thing legally in Oregon and Washington. If you're philosophically opposed to death by any other means than just natural final decrepitude or accidental whatever, then you're probably not going to be able to open your mind to this. But if you're willing to sort of think like a grown-up for a few minutes, sit down and clear-eyedly look at the issue, you can see where if someone has no quality of life or is looking at a future with no quality of life and doesn't want to go through that, then what is the point? Who is benefiting? If the person themselves feel that they aren't benefiting, then who are you to write in and say, well, I'll feel better? Well, it's not your life. It's the other person's life. So if they need help from a doctor in Oregon and Washington, they can get it, or in the Netherlands or Switzerland or Belgium. And coming soon, California, Montana has a strong possibility of going that way. But I think that people get it. People are starting to open up about this, and they're not afraid as much as they used to be. And I think that's a good thing. People should be a little bit more clear-eyed about some of these issues and not so afraid.
Talk a little bit about the difference between your father's death and your mother's. Your father was in the final throes of cancer, and certainly the end would have been near regardless. With your mother, it was a very different situation. Tell us about that.
Oh, very, very much so. I like to say that my father was in midair. He was falling off the cliff, and he was going to hit bottom in a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks maximum. And so when you're imagine yourself in that position, saying, I know what's coming. Let's just take care of this right now, so that I don't have to go through these weeks of pain. And for him, it wasn't just falling through air; it was great pain. Because his body was riddled with cancer everywhere in his body, skeleton everywhere. My mother was very different because she had a couple of physical ailments, but her primary concern was her Alzheimer's, her growing lack of ability to remember things and to control her emotions and that sort of thing. And she was a psychologist, and she had built a life and a career out of strong-mindedness, and her personality and her sense of self were entirely wrapped up around that way of being. And so for her, the cruelest torture imaginable was to be slowly losing her mind. This finely honed machine of hers was turning into mush, and she, again, saw only one way out. She was not falling off the cliff. She was sort of slowly rolling down the gentle incline, but there was only one direction it was going to go, and she did not want to be spoon-fed by strangers and have herself bathed by people she didn't know and not remember who was who from one moment to another. It was just an assault to her sense of dignity and her sense of self, and she said, no, I'm not going to get there. And it was a very brave, very courageous thing for her to do. I think it's certainly the alpha and the omega of examples, my father's case and my mother's case, 1 minute to go and then a couple of hours to go, metaphorically speaking, to take that active step and say, this is a life that I am not interested in living because it is so horrible to me. And I talk in the book about the difference between physical pain and emotional pain, and who's to say which is worse, and I think the answer is clear. It's the person who's experiencing it and nobody else.
What about in your mother's case, though, in terms of the sense of timing, and when might have been the right time?
Well, the right time was the time that we ultimately decided, and the reason for that is that it was the time that she decided was right for her. I went so far as to tell her directly that I would rather she stay alive, and I would take care of her and arrange for her to have the very best of care. Heck, she could still be alive today physically, but she wouldn't be herself. She would be this body, maybe ambulatory, maybe not. But she wanted to go, as she put it, soon, but not too soon. We'd monitor the situation. She was, after all, a scientist, and so she and I regularly talked about how she was feeling and what she thought and what she felt. We sort of slowly stepped up towards the edge, and when she was well and truly ready and had no reservations, we set the time and we moved forward. And I was really amazed when the actual event occurred, and I think it tells in the book, it shows through that I was just amazed at how strong she was. Here was someone who could have stuck around for another couple of months or years of having some ability to enjoy certain small pieces of life, perhaps, although lots of unhappiness. And she was just saying, nope, I'm not going to do that, and give me some more pills. Let's go. Here we go. Keep going. It was very impressive to me. I hope that when and if my time comes to make that decision, I can do it with as much grace and strength of character.
Is there a different set of responsibilities that someone has, that you have in these cases, that is emotionally connected to the person that is assisting them in this suicide, as opposed to a clinician that might be doing it from an objective perspective?
Well, absolutely, and that is part of the reason that my underlying thesis is that this is not something for family and friends to do. It impacts the emotional relationship between the dying person and the living person, the assister, if you will, or assistance provider. And of course, backing up a step, if I'm going to my doctor and saying, Doc, I'm ready for the pills, and he or she asks me the necessary questions and gives me the hairy eyeball and says, yeah, I think it's appropriate, they're making an objective decision. But if I have to go to my sibling or my child or my parent, they may have reservations personally, and that's not really their call to make. And they may change their mind, and it's really only up to me, the decision maker, to change my mind or not. I can always get the pills from my doctor and go home and change my mind. That happens all the time in Oregon, where it's legal. People get the pills, and they're happy to have them in case they need them, and they end up never using them, dying without them. But it is much more difficult for loved ones to make this decision. I don't think they should have to. I would like to think we'll propel the laws and the change in the laws forward so that nobody else will ever have to do what I did ever again, because it's not for civilians. It should be for the professionals.
How much was your willingness and your understanding and willingness to talk to your mother about this, to what extent did that impact on her thinking and her decision-making process?
Well, I think it was exactly what she wanted and needed. She was a psychologist. She was a big believer in talking through problems and exploring the ramifications. She in fact turned the tables on me a couple of times, and I would be talking to her about how she was feeling, how she was handling all this. Was she still sure? Was she still wanting to move forward? And she would say yes, 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 and then she would say, how are you doing? How are you doing with all this? How are you coping? How are you holding up? Are you okay with this? She, if anything, my involvement might have slowed down her decision-making process to go forward, because she wanted to be sure that I was okay. Mm-hmm. Although I think the initial thrust of your question was, my being so willing, did that help her along? I think it helped ease her mind that I was capable and competent and willing to help her, and also willing to stop and wait, because at one point there was a hitch in the plans, which affected me a great deal, but I couldn't let on that it was affecting me, because it wasn't my choice. It was my mother's choice, and I had to roll with whatever punches she was throwing, and that was very difficult. But I loved her, and I told her I was going to help her get what she needed, and so I just had to go along with the program and tough it out.
What about bringing other family members in on this decision and this process, for your sister, for example?
Well, neither of my sisters were very involved in family decision-making for many years, and so they weren't really in the loop, if you will. I am, or was, the lawyer and the competent, sort of easygoing one, and much more following in my parents' footsteps in terms of professionalism and social style. So I was their, much more stylistically, if you will, their representative, and they also knew they could rely on me, and there wouldn't be any excess stuff going on. It would just be cool-headed and clear-eyed.
Was there a sense that if either of your sisters were involved or knew about this, that somehow it would have stopped the process?
Yes, that's part of it as well. And not all families, in most families, not everybody is on exactly the same page. In our family, people were on very different pages in some respects. But you can imagine that if it's open to a family vote and someone doesn't care for it, that could throw a wrench into the whole works. And in a situation like ours, the way things are currently, when it's illegal, if someone knows about it and wants to put a stop to it, they can alert the authorities and or cause trouble in other ways. And if and when it becomes illegal, then all that person can do is exert their own emotional venting needs and cause disruption within the family. And that's why I think ultimately this has to be a completely personal decision. If you want to notify your family that you're doing this and enjoy whatever emotional conversation they wish to have with you, you're free to do so. But if you want to just take care of things on your own and let people find out about it later so that you don't have to put up with the yelling and screaming or whatever it might be, then that's why it should be between the patient and the doctor alone. And I think from a psychological standpoint, it would be a good idea for people to share this with friends and family, but that has to be their own choice, and people have to live their own lives in their own way, stylistically and ethically.
And what about the reaction of other members of your family now that this is out in the public?
Well, the most important person in my life as a relative is my Aunt Nancy, my father's sister. And she is 100% behind what I did and making progress and et cetera. A couple of cousins are okay with what happened. They're not necessarily okay with the publicity around it. And my sisters are not all that thrilled with the publicity around it, although I think they're relatively sanguine about the actual aspect of having the choice and making decisions about ending one's life on one's own terms. But I have to say, what really astounds me is the public response. What someone asked me the other day, what's the most surprising thing that's happened with all this? And for me, it's the surprising, overwhelming, positive response. I was sort of hoping for 60-40, which was the approximate percentage of passage of the bill in Washington State, making it like Oregon, having physician-assisted death with dignity up there. But 90% plus of the responses to the Good Morning America website after I did their show, and to my own website and other places, and phone calls coming in, overwhelmingly positive, even from people who identified themselves as conservative and or otherwise not terribly liberal.
How do you respond to the broader slippery slope argument that I'm sure you hear?
Well, everything is slippery in life. There really is no black and white. And people who think there is, I think they would like to believe that there is, but there really isn't. Some people couch it in terms of, well, this could open the door to abuses of one kind or another, and I say to them, so you think there aren't abuses now for some reason? I mean, there are abuses of every system. As long as there's a system, there will be abuses. I think of it this way: if you take something that is currently illegal, let's look back a couple of decades. Consider abortion. Is it better to have abortion as a legal, medically regulated and controlled and antiseptic kind of a process, or is it really better to have in the back alleys with coat hangers? I think we all know the answer to that. And that same thing applies to this. If there is some kind of legal structure and oversight and just accepted legal process for this that makes it a clean, medical, known process, then a whole bunch of trouble and manipulation and slippery slope kinds of arguments disappear because a lot more is being eyeballed and looked at. So there has to be at least something in place to give people this freedom so that they can do it legally and safely. Because, you know, as I write about in the book, I'm not a doctor. Maybe the drugs I was giving my parents maybe there wasn't enough, and maybe I would have botched the job, and they would have ended up in comas, which they would have both hated, and it would have been a worse situation. Not to mention, how did all this stuff get in there, and let's eyeball people and throw somebody in jail, which I would not have enjoyed either.
One of the other things that enters into the slippery slope argument is the economic consideration, unfortunately. We know that the vast majority of healthcare costs come in these final throes of people's lives, and it's impossible to have this conversation without looking at it in the broader context, I suppose.
Well, there are two sides to that sword. That I'm glad you brought that up. There are tremendous medical costs at the end of life, and some people were positing to me the idea that doctors and hospitals are making a lot of money on keeping people alive, and I know that that's actually not true because I have a number of doctor friends, and there are disincentives to hospitals and doctors for keeping people in the hospital longer. The insurance companies are going to pay you to keep someone there for a day and a half for procedure X and a day and a quarter for procedure Y, and not going to pay you a penny more. But what is implicated, I think, is the warehousing of people in some of these retirement communities. Studies have shown that not only are the number of people in retirement homes, nursing homes, convalescent homes, these sorts of places, not only are more and more people going into those places, but studies and exposés have shown that there's an awful lot of abuse of those elderly people and vulnerable people in there, and that's not what anybody wants at the end of life. And these people are just there keeping people alive so that they can get that monthly check from the family or from Medicare or whatever. Now, I'm not saying that they all do bad works by any means, and in fact, some of those places are just fantastic, and certainly the hospice people who are trying to help those who want to sort of naturally go and not be kept alive, they do just amazing angel-type work. But the other aspect of this coin is the sort of larger philosophical financial picture, if you don't mind such a long sentence. And I think about this in terms of my own situation. Let's say I find myself with 6 months to live. I know I've got this incurable cancer, and I can take all this chemo, and I can do radiation, and I can do this, and I can do that, and I can travel to Timbuktu and get some new treatment and try this and try that. But in my heart of hearts, I know, the light at the end of the tunnel is a train. So I can spend all this money. Let's say I've got lots of money myself, or I have a great insurance policy, and I can say, okay, let's do everything we can. Or I have an option, and I personally feel that I would take the option of, look, I'm not going to stick around and go through all of this. I'm not going to be a medical Cupid doll or pincushion or whatever you want to call it. I'll have a nice party. Let's have plenty of guacamole and margaritas. All my friends come over. We'll shoot the breeze and talk about old times, and then they'll scoot, and I'll check out. And all of those resources I would direct, if they were my own private funds, I would say, have those go to inoculate about 100,000 kids against polio, or feed an entire community in Alabama or Zimbabwe or Montana or something like that, or free up those medical resources so that instead of this hospital having to spend a couple $100,000 on me, they can spend it on some emergency care of some kids with broken legs or some traumatic victims of head injuries who don't have insurance, and because they have a future. I don't, and so I'm fine with that. Some people aren't. Some people want to cling to every last moment of brain-addled and pain-riddled, bedridden existence they can get, and under our current system, they're entitled to do so. But those of us who would rather not go through all that pain and agony at the end would like to have the choice. And I think most people would like to have the choice. Whether they use it or not, it's nice to have it available.
What about the conflict in the medical community, the reaction in the medical community, and the doctor's first responsibility to do no harm?
Well, the medical community is enlightened, is growing more enlightened about this. The old first do no harm imprecation that comes from, I believe, Aesculapius or Hippocrates or wherever it comes from. At that time, I've been informed that the definition of harm included cutting into the body. So once we developed surgery, we were already violating that original ancient tenet. Time changes perceptions and definitions and awareness of what is helping. And I think that a lot of people in the medical community are moving towards the sense of people's quality of life, the patient's quality of life, as having a place in the discussion. It used to be that the doctors would say, "I'm going to fix you. I don't care what you want to do. I'll make that gallbladder behave, and I'll go in there and cut and paste and do whatever, and ta-dam, look what I've done." It's all about the doctor. It's not so much anymore, although historically surgeons still are cowboys, and good for them sometimes. But you do have to take the patient's needs into consideration, and I think that's being done more and more.
At what point, though, do we determine that patients are able, especially terminal patients, are able to make these decisions on their own, and at what point does that responsibility fall on the family, and what changes once that responsibility shifts?
Well, it is always and forever the patient's choice. Now, how that choice gets expressed can shift. For example, there exists today in almost all major medical decisions, patients has to sign a waiver, or they have to sign a document that says, "I know that there are risks to this procedure," or whatever. And there are certain medical oversights towards with major procedures. You never have one brain surgeon alone doing something. There's always someone there to assist or take over or eyeball something else, or there are structures in place to protect people. The situation that you're probably thinking about is what happens when someone says, or someone is already in a deadly circumstance and wants to make a decision. That's where part of the problem comes from. If people don't talk about this and think about this ahead of time and fill out the necessary forms on their advance directive to physicians or durable power of attorney for health care, that sort of thing, then they may get to a point where they have a brain injury and they can't speak or they can't express themselves, or some kind of neurological condition like Alzheimer's has affected them, or some other communication problem happens. And so that's why this sort of thing should be thought about ahead of time. So let's say at my age now, I make this decision, and let's say there's this wonderful new checkbox or two on the directive to physicians, or a place where I can write in my desires, and I say, okay, if I'm non-responsive for more than a couple of hours, then I designate my friend Joe Blow or my relative Jane Doe to make the decision to tell the caring people, the hospital or whoever, to not only stop treatments but also inject me with the fatal cocktail, because I do not want to live like Terry Schiavo or Nancy Cruzan or any of these other people that we've famously heard about who lived in comas as vegetables for years and years and years. Now, if I change my mind, I can always say so. Well, unless, of course, I have a communication problem, in which case there is a gap. But people who consciously make this choice, I think, are on record as knowing that this is something that they want. They may not always want it. They may change their mind. If they can change their mind, if they're able to, or if they do change their mind and if they're able to communicate it, then everything stops. They, stay on as much life support as we've got until unless they change their mind again. And if they change their mind again, we do have to assess their mental state. There's a thing in the law where if you're going to make a plea bargain, for instance, you have to make what they call a knowing, intelligent, and voluntary waiver of your rights. And it all boils down to the same thing. It's competent. And who makes that decision? I think, again, that has to be a professional making that decision. It has to be a doctor, probably someone trained in psychiatry, and perhaps with extra special training in death issues, and that understands more of the social and familial and emotional aspects of end of life as well as the medical aspects.
What's been the most aggressive criticism that you've received to this?
I think the most aggressive criticism I've received have been along the lines of, how dare you think that you can play God, and no one has the right to do such a thing, and etc. And I scratch my head and I say, okay, well, let's see, doctors play God all the time when they save someone, and in this case, what the patient wanted saving from was the pain and agony of a future that was horrific to her, and so wasn't I doing a good thing? So I understand people's having a point of view like that. It comes from their cultural training, religious, social, whatever it might be, and they're entitled to their opinion, and they're entitled to live their life and die their death the way they wish to. But I would ask them not to force their beliefs upon me, since what I would be doing isn't hurting them in the least.
John West. John, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you'll join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share it and help other people find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.